Are there anybody here from the class of 78? Any hands?
76.
Oh, excuse me, 1976. Are there any folk here whose experience of that place, which we can talk about in just a sec, go that far back? No.
As a reporter.
That counts?
Oh,
Getting the word out? Yeah. That's wonderful. How about from 1983? Hands. And you're still here doing the work. I just want to acknowledge our movement elders. Anybody go over the wire in 1987? Not thinking of anyone in particular. Hands all the way up. Former Senator Joe Valentine, friend, colleague, mentor, wonderful campaigner and activist, is here tonight as well. 2002. Can't just be me. Others. Yeah, there are a few. And some ratbags who stole into the place and camped themselves up on the roof in about 2005. Couple of hands. Thanks and acknowledgements to all the people who've been keeping that candle alight and keeping the hopes for a better world alive and using that place, not that far from where we're meeting tonight, as a focal point, as very important reasons why we do use it as a focal point. Having these extraordinary guests here, and in particular having Professor Tanta go through some of the technical capabilities of the base, I thought it would probably make most sense if I just spoke of the politics, rather than what we know of actually what occurs at the base, because I think there's opportunities tomorrow to hear a little bit more about that as well, and that's not my area of expertise. Last time I was down at the front gates was 2002 as well, and in that time we were 6 months out from shock and awe. We were 6 months, we didn't know it at the time, and if you were like me, you probably thought maybe some survival instinct, respect for international law, basic common sense, strategic intelligence might keep that decision from being made. But in 2002 we were part of a global uprising, the largest in history of civil society to try and stop a war. And we were right. And those who prosecuted the case for the war were wrong. Some of them knew at the time that they were wrong and that they were lying to us, but they just figured they knew best. And so here we are. Here we are. I think it's worth talking a little bit about, before we come back to the situation that we found ourselves in 30 years on, to talk a little bit about the other jointly operated outpost of the United States government, and I'm referring, of course, to the Prime Minister's office in Parliament House. The politics that we confront when we're doing that work, Lee and myself and our colleagues in Parliament House, some of the mechanics and how things might change, and I figured it might be worth it. For those who are sticking around tomorrow, and I certainly strongly encourage people to do that, where we'll be able to get hands-on with how to change the situation that we all recognise and respect has gone terribly wrong. Parliament is often a numbers game, but the way that the kind of issues that we have heard about tonight play out, both in a foreign policy, a defence policy and a technical side, is kind of twofold. So firstly, self-imposed, almost automatic bipartisanship on anything of consequence that relates to national security or defence. So that's your ground condition. If it's a Labor government, you won't get the coalition to stand up and make impressive speeches about how nobody was consulted before they implanted a Marine Corps facility in Darwin. They didn't do that. You might have noticed they didn't do that. Similarly, when the Tories are in government, Labor caves in automatically, reflexively, without a second thought on mass surveillance proposals like mandatory data retention, or basically anything with the words national security in the title. They will simply cave in. They managed to, in this cheerful bipartisan way that you won't often read about, they combine to weaken or neutralise committee reports or prevent inquiries from happening at all. They can vote down motions or refuse to debate them altogether, and there's a variety of ways to lock down Parliament's normal oversight tools, which commonly on domestic issues work tolerably well, certainly better than in some other parts of the world. But in defence and national security issues, we can have an argument about where the ADF buy their boots from, and that can get litigated and argued about for months and months at a time, so that some defence questions do happen. Or we can have arguments over where this extraordinarily expensive fleet of submarines that will be obsolete on the day they're put to sea get built, and where those jobs occur. But the basic underlying strategic direction and doctrine, we just have this automatic bipartisan consensus which is difficult to crack. The second way in which it's done, and speaking just of the kind of formal political stuff at the moment, and I recognise that our movement is much broader and deeper than that, is to ensure that the real power lies with the executive and doesn't come anywhere near Parliament. So do not anticipate that your Parliament or your parliamentarians or the people that you elect, or whatever your political persuasion, actually get within a mile of where these decisions are actually being taken. The decisions lie with the executive and with the agencies and the service branches themselves. So a couple of quick examples. There's a Joint Committee on Intelligence and Security. There are no crossbenchers on that committee. For a period of time when data retention was being debated, it was all blokes. It was entirely an old boys committee with no crossbenchers on it, and it has no operational oversight. So even unlike US congressional committees that can actually, in camera, behind closed doors, interrogate what's happening at an operational level, the Australian Parliament has no such mechanism for doing that. The Treaties Committee, where some of these agreements are signed, doesn't get eyes on to a treaty instrument affecting trade deal like the Trans-Pacific Partnership or defence agreements. Doesn't get eyes on to those agreements until after they have been signed. So knock yourselves out, you know. And it's still a valuable entity. We managed to hold up the Russian uranium deal through that same committee for about 2.5 years before the government caved in. The committee said, don't do it. The government said, oh, we'll think about it, okay, we will. And then the next thing you know, the Russian government is in Crimea and, oh no, actually we're going to cancel uranium sales to Russia. But the committee itself didn't get our hands on the agreement until after the thing was signed. And of course, the Defence White Paper, where a lot of these doctrines are set down, written and agreed on in a bipartisan way without any recourse to parliamentary institutions at all. Nobody's ever seen the legal instrument underpinning the US deployment into Darwin. They won't give us the legal underpinnings. They've said that there's no change or amendment to the Status of Forces Agreement, but there is a document there somewhere that governs that deployment, and no member of the public has seen it. And of course the big one is the decision to deploy, or to let the United States government deploy through Darwin, or any of the other Australian defence properties which they operate through, is in the hands of the executive. That fundamental decision about whether to deploy into war is in the hands of the Prime Minister, not the Parliament. So in combination with that setup, with that stale political setup that has prevailed since, you could argue, the Whitlam years, and that ended well, in combination with the physical footprint of the bases in the Northern Territory and of places like Pine Gap, or the port infrastructure through which nuclear, armed and powered warships transit without any warning to the host populations, we're basically fully...
Sorry, it's just going on.
It's okay. We're completely enmeshed. And I guess you can imagine, and it won't be news to the audience in this room, that while these bases exist, it's impossible to have an independent foreign or defence policy. It's simply not feasible. We established through a parliamentary committee a couple of years ago that the Marine base in Darwin, and even they're starting to call it a base now, so at least we're not having that boring back and forth, could be used for deployment, not simply training. They could bounce out special forces or intelligence or US Marine Corps personnel and gear and deploy into the region from that base. This is not a training or any kind of rotational anything. And in 2011, when President Obama visited Canberra and announced formally that encirclement of China's strategy, this Asia-Pacific rebalancing or pivot, it probably seemed like the Middle East was a done deal. It's like the strategic genius that brought you peace in the Middle East is now turning our attention to China, and Australia is going to be one of the first beneficiaries of that. We thought at the time that one of the reasons that Australia was being sought for basing rights in the Northern Territory was the extraordinary people's movement in Okinawa and in Guam and in Vieques in Puerto Rico, where they actually kicked out the US Navy in about 2002 and closed that weapons base. But in practice what it means is that Australia submits to participating in an illegal invasion and an occupation that has torn the region apart and paved the way for the emergence of Islamic State. Hundreds of thousands of people died on that decision. The region's in meltdown, and even the impending assault on Islamic State strongholds, everybody seems to agree, is likely to dramatically increase the risk of terrorism worldwide. And so the geniuses that set this horror in motion, none of them have ever been held to account, let alone prosecuted. Not a single one of those people who led us into that horror show have been prosecuted, and these are the same people who now insist that as a consequence, the only way for us to stay safe is to submit to mass surveillance. That's how to stay safe. And to watch while centuries of legal due process are dismantled under this same shroud of bipartisanship. Anyway, this is probably all reasonably familiar to this audience. All right. It's like, I might just shout, but we'll see if this one works. So I think it's likely that it's us in here demanding a profound change in direction that we'll be the ones painted as extremists. We didn't start the war. We were the ones who tried to stop it. I suspect every person in this room played their part in trying to stop the lunatics from doing what they have done, tearing that region apart, costing hundreds of thousands of lives, and now leading us to this extraordinary doctrine where massive violence is proposed as the solution to the previous round of massive violence. Just trust us and submit to mass surveillance to make sure that none of you are making trouble. So, what to do? Firstly, and these are just some very sketchy thoughts because I know that I'm speaking to a room full of practitioners who in some instances have made this your life's work. So these are some fairly quick throwaway ideas. So firstly, what if we built a strong network of dedicated people from all over the country and then brought them together so that they could build trust and share expertise?
Yes.
How about this?
Yeah.
Here you are. So this is going well. The second one, think hard about where people are at. There's a measure of skepticism, I think well-founded skepticism in the Australian population about the role of the United States in setting our foreign and defence policy. And the Trump experiment, I guess, is raising the anxiety levels. For most people, the US alliance just probably feels like a fact of life. But as it was pointed out to me just before we came in here, the idea that an orange, narcissistic fascist is only one vote from the Oval Office is actually scaring the crap out of people, left and right, in the United States and here in Australia. What better time, because this window may only, 45, 50 days out from the US election. So that window of skepticism and of querying, do we actually want our foreign policy set by that guy? That is a window for a conversation to be provoked. And as Jeremy Scahill writes on The Intercept, actually Secretary Clinton is the preferred candidate of empire. So it's not like, do you want your Armageddon fast or slow? But there is at least a moment of opportunity that people might be rethinking the kind of strategic disasters that we may be led into under a Trump presidency, worth thinking about. And also, I thought I had a copy with me of David Rosenberg's book. I did bring it up. I don't know whether anybody's had a look at this. From 2011, The Spy Who Came In From the Desert. He worked in Pine Gap. There are a couple of redactions, which I presume are just basically there for dramatic flourish. And Flick reminded me before they've redacted a section of Hansard, which is kind of funny when you think about it. You can't read it in this book, but it is on the permanent parliamentary record. But it is worthwhile to get a sense of how the people who work in this facility, and I'm just assuming there are a couple of spooks in the room, it would be kind of odd if there weren't, but how the people who make their life's work keeping us safe in facilities like this view the work that they do and how they view us. And there are some useful insights in this book on that score. Bringing our work to a wider audience and figuring out how to regenerate the movement in our language. So, what do we do that brings the interest and concerns of the next generation for whom the Cold War, they might have come across it in school, they might not. The Cold War is kind of rapidly receding. The threat of nuclear weapons, something that activated 2, 3 generations of people, of campaigners around the world, even though that particular movement is undergoing an extraordinary resurgence at the moment, and I think it provides one of the most important examples for international collaboration, but there's a generation of people coming through now who haven't thought about those issues as much as those who came before. But they are interested in drones and autonomous weapons. They are interested in what Ed Snowden and Julian Assange and Chelsea Manning revealed to us about modern warfare. 3 individuals who couldn't be here tonight because they are under various forms of incarceration. And Chelsea in particular being subjected to the most sadistic treatment for revealing war crimes to a whistleblowing website that would then put that material onto the front pages of the world's newspapers. But people pay an inordinately high cost for bringing these truths to us. And that has activated a generation of people who are asking what's being done in our name. And that refreshed push on nuclear weapons and on the ban, the possibility that by this time next year, an instrument will be under draft for a formal legal ban of these horrific weapons of mass destruction that could indeed find themselves in the event of a nuclear exchange, could find themselves being guided and tracked through a base not 20 kilometres from here. So the things that we can do, and I think tomorrow is going to be an important part of this conversation, to bring our work to a wider audience who are going to look and maybe bear an interest in the 21st century dimensions of warfare and what's being done in our name. And obviously not giving up on Parliament, and if I thought it was a waste of space, we wouldn't work there. There's obviously a great deal that we can do about rebooting the debate about war powers and about Australian aggression. Where should the decision to deploy lie? Should we introduce into the Australian Constitution an Article 9 that simply forbids armed aggression? Why is that not something that is in the Constitution of every civilized country around the world? And strength to those of our Japanese colleagues who are doing everything they can under a pretty hardline right-wing government that is trying to water down that important expression of peaceful optimism in the Japanese Constitution. And what about an inquiry into the war in Iraq? What about holding some of these people to account who still lecture us on what we should do to stay safe after initiating that horror show? And holding the focus on Pine Gap. And finally, I think that probably the most important thing and why this weekend is so exciting is that we can't do this work on an island. Without strong and growing relationships with like-minded colleagues overseas, we will stay trapped in our little bubble. We can learn so much from peace workers overseas and from exchanging elements of the struggle, exchanging tactics, just learning about the different dimensions and the different footprint. Because as empire is global, actually so is global civil society. And it's one of the things that's scariest about the militarization of the internet, is that this is one of the ways in which we can dissolve some of those boundaries of tribalism which have been weaponized for decades or centuries even, that we can simply no longer afford to let that happen. But we have the tools of these communications media now to actually be able to just sidestep government for a moment and reach out to brothers and sisters and families and campaigners in other parts of the world, struggling in some instances under vastly more difficult circumstances than we do here in Australia, and build those links, build those person-to-person and community-to-community links, which I think is probably the only way in which we're going to make war obsolete and have that facility shut down once and for all. So thanks very much for coming out.